Welcome to Apple Core, a podcast about the history of Apple. In each episode, we travel back in time to explore the history behind a different Apple product and consider what it tells us about where the company may be heading next. I'm Graham Bauer, a designer, writer, and long-time Apple user.
I'm Charlie Sorrell, a writer, podcaster, and general nerd.
And we have a very special guest with us today. Griffin Jones is here. Hi, Griffin. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. I'm writer. Everybody's heard me before. I don't need to. I'm not new.
It needs no introduction, but yeah, friend of the show, Griffin Jones is one of the hosts of the enormously popular and influential podcast, The Cultcast. And yeah, he's joining us today for our discussion on iOS 7, which was the last major design refresh of the iOS user interface, doing away with the glossy 3D hyper-realistic look of the original iPhone and introducing a new flat language of design. Before we get into it, as we usually do, I wanted to start us off with a bit of a warm-up and a couple of teaser questions, if you guys are ready.
Ready.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question, what is skeuomorphism?
Do you mean Pete skeuomorphism?
This is a private joke between me and Charlie. Pete Scudamore is a famous British jockey. And whenever I say skeuomorphism, I get mixed up and say skeuomorphism instead. And it's probably even seeped into previous episodes of this show.
It has.
But today I'm really going to try and get it right. But I might not be able to say it, Charlie, but can you define it?
I feel like one of us should give like the obvious wrong answer. Skeuomorphism is shadows and gradients and colors and textures, isn't it?
That is the obvious wrong answer. I think that a lot of people think that's what it means. But now, sage Mr. Charlie is going to enlighten us with the truth.
That's so wrong, Griffin. The skeuomorphism is when a computer interface mimics aspects of a real-world interface in order to be easier to use. So it doesn't have to have shadows and all those kinds of things. For instance, a guitar amplifier application might have knobs which look like the knobs on a real guitar amplifier, which makes things easier to use because when you're coming from the real world into the computer world, you already have everything you've learned about how things work is already there.
Although in our circles, we use it in the context of software interfaces. It's not just that, like there are physical older examples of skeuomorphism as well, like a digital camera that still makes the camera shutter sound that a DSLR might have, even though it's mirrorless, or, you know, a house with storm shutters on the side that are purely decorative and don't actually move. They're just like nailed to the wall and also wouldn't cover the windows if they were to move.
Exactly. Yeah. So the dictionary definition here is really that when a design continues to feature elements that are no longer technically required, but the designer retains those elements because they help the user to read the object for its purpose. So as you said, the storm shutters that are just decorative on the front of a house, or also if a house has got a pediment with columns in front of the door and those columns are not supporting the pediment, they're just there to make the entryway look grand. Then those are other examples of skeuomorphism. So skeuomorphism was very dominant in Apple's design language before iOS 7. And with iOS 7, as we're going to unpack in this episode, Apple lurched in the other direction towards a very abstract and flat design language. In the intervening years since Apple developed this iOS 7 design language, a new user interface design movement has emerged dubbed neuromorphism. Can either of you describe what neuromorphism is?
I can say that neuromorphism is an interface design which still takes cues from the real world in that it uses 3D effects to make it more obvious what the controls are and what they do, but doesn't actually mimic the real world. It doesn't have textured wood or leather.
Yeah, it's like a happy medium between skeuomorphism and minimalism. It's sort of meeting somewhere in the middle. That's very annoying because that means that you guys got both of my teaser questions right. Next episode, I'm going to make them much, much tougher. I was too easy on you guys.
Yeah, these are too easy.
It's an easy one.
Why even bother?
I thought I would have you on neuromorphism, but no. Okay, before we get into it, as is our tradition, setting the scene, iOS 7 was announced at WWDC 2013. Frozen was letting it go at the box office. Captain Lee set sail on his first season of Below Deck. Imagine Dragons were radioactive. Bruno Mars remembered when he was our man, and Miley Cyrus was riding her wrecking ball. Meanwhile, Apple was taking a wrecking ball to the iPhone's user interface, and Steve Jobs had passed away 2 years earlier in 2011. This was the year that... Oh, you're going to say something there.
And also, Matt Smith was meeting David Tennant in the Doctor Who 50th anniversary.
Oh my goodness, you had to make this show even more geeky with the Doctor Who reference. Thank you very much for that, Griffin. Yes, indeed. So where was I? This was actually the year that Apple launched the cylindrical Mac Pro. This was a slightly sticky time for Apple because Apple's financial results had disappointed analysts, and the company's reputation was still somewhat tarnished from the iOS 6 Maps debacle 1 year prior. And we've done a whole episode on the iOS 6 Maps debacle. So if you haven't listened to that, then I recommend it to your attention. Tim Cook, at the WWDC keynote in 2013, said this of iOS 7. And I want to do my Tim Cook impression here because I like that Southern enthusiasm, which I want to try and encapsulate. So iOS 7 is the biggest change to iOS since the introduction of the iPhone. It's packed with amazing new features and a stunning new user interface.
It's actually pretty good, Tim Cook.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm impressed.
Everybody usually leans way too hard into the Southern accent.
Tim Cook was clearly very excited, but then he's always very excited when he's announcing a new product. And they showed one of these Jony Ive videos to launch iOS 7, and it got a standing ovation. Then, I'm just going to do one more bit of Tim Cook impression. He said, "This was only possible because of the collaboration between Jony and his amazing design team and Craig and his incredible engineering team."
Just to interrupt briefly.
Oh, God, go on.
I got one problem with that impersonation.
Oh.
You pronounced it Craig instead of Craig.
Oh, does it say Craig?
He says Craig. Everyone, yeah. It's like it's like people call you Graham.
You know, as this podcast progresses, I am going to work on fine-tuning my Tim Cook impression because, Charlie, you now have cornered the market in Jony Ive, and so I feel I want to be Tim. I'm going to work on this. I'm going to listen. I'm going to train until I have it down.
And I would say maybe like 50% too much emotion.
Yeah.
Especially 2013 Tim Cook.
Oh, yeah, you think he's been dialing it up a little bit. I like that we need to get it year appropriate as well. So Tim Cook was really ladling on the praise for Jony Ive. This was something that was very much the design was credited to Jony. I'm not sure that that's entirely right, and we're going to get into that a bit. But, it was very much seen because of the changing of the guard that we're going to look at. Jony Ive had taken over and had really put his stamp on the look of iOS. So we're going to unpack that in this episode. Who wants to be Craig?
I can do Craig. I'm an American.
Okay, I'm going to put this in the chat. So you got 2 quotes there.
"We just completely ran out of green felt" is the first one.
Yeah, so what was that a reference to?
That was a reference to Game Center. You know, in a span of like a single screen, you would have the green felt of a pool table, the varnished wood mahogany in the tab bar on the bottom. The tab bar icons would be this shiny, polished gold. And if you had the multitasking switcher open, then you would have that gray linen texture as well. So many textures just within the span of 3.5 inches of your iPhone 4.
If anything says gaming to a young person brought up on mobile games, it's felt and wood and brass.
Maybe a little unintentionally prescient at that time that it replicated a casino, although I don't think in-app purchases were available in iOS 7 yet.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. So Craig Federighi made this quip about how they'd run out of green felt, and the whole audience burst out laughing. It was such an open joke at this point. And I think maybe the design of Game Center with its casino theming was one of the most egregious uses of skeuomorphism. There were some particular elements, and we're going to get into a few more, where really iOS had jumped the shark. It's just gone too far, and it really needs to be dialed back. And so I don't think it was any accident that Craig Federighi zoomed in on Game Center's green felt. Griffin, you've got another quote there.
"Installing iOS 7 on your phone is like getting an entirely new phone, one that you know how to use, one that's so much more beautiful and functional than ever before." I also remember one more quote that he said when they were demoing iOS 7 and they showed the new call screen. And, it's like this beautiful thing with like these green gradients and shiny buttons on the bottom. And Craig said, "Your friends have never looked more attractive."
Yeah. Not at all problematic kind of gag there, but yes. Craig had that line in Problematic Dad Jokes. I think he still does, but they've dialed him back as the format of the keynotes has got even more pre-recorded and safer. Okay, so that's our preamble. Getting into it, I would say, to tell the story of iOS 7 and this radical departure from skeuomorphism into flat design, it's impossible to tell this story without really telling the story of the leaders at Apple at the time. So Steve Jobs, Jony Ive, and Scott Forstall. And that's really the story we're going to get into today because, well, obviously back in the Steve Jobs years, Steve was the boss and his word was golden. But then he had his two golden boys, Jony Ive on the hardware design side and Scott Forstall on the software design side. And that triumvirate together were really the product masterminds during this era.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're going to get complaints otherwise. I think it's triumvirate.
Oh my goodness, I've done it again.
But
okay,
that's okay.
Say that again.
Triumvirate.
So I said triumvirate, and you're saying triumvirate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Triumvirate.
The three wise leaders.
The three big boss guys that dominated the company's product design approach. They were Steve Jobs, Jony Ive, and Scott Forstall. We obviously had other leaders at Apple at the time, like Tim Cook, but it was much more focused on the business side of things and the supply chain side of things, whereas these three people, Steve at the top, and then Jony Ive and Scott Forstall for hardware and software, respectively.
I believe Scott Forstall's job was just iPhone software at the time. I don't think he was in command of macOS software, unless I'm mistaken.
If you look at Scott Forstall's progression through the company, when we told the story of Next and Next Step, we talked about how Steve Jobs hired Scott Forstall. Scott's interview wasn't with Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs kind of barged in and took over the interview. And according to Scott Forstall, what they really connected on was user interface design. Scott Forstall had a particular fascination with UI and particularly had a love for skeuomorphism. And that is actually the conversation that he had in his interview with Steve Jobs is what persuaded him to go to Next Step. He had a lot of offers on the table and he already had a plum job offer from Microsoft. And there was really no reason for Scott Forstall to trek all the way to a tiny and failing company. But it was that conversation about UI design and skeuomorphism that persuaded Scott Forstall to go to Next. And Scott Forstall worked on the user interface for Next Step, the Next operating system that became macOS 10 when Next was acquired by Apple. And at that point, Steve put Scott onto the Aqua user interface. So that Aqua user interface was then really instrumental to re-establishing Apple as being at the forefront of computer design, not just in the hardware with Jony Ive, but the incredible lickable macOS 10 user interface that Scott Forstall worked on. Steve Jobs, when he returned to Apple, he had a similar conversation with Jony Ive to the one that he had had with Scott Forstall years prior, where he found that he and Jony were very much on the same page when it came to hardware design. And so there were many other brilliant business minds and technology minds at Apple, but in terms of product minds, this was really Apple's brain trust that engineered the product turnaround, both in hardware and user interface, over that period of Apple's turnaround in the aughts.
I think Forstall's interesting because he was clearly deep in with Jobs in the same way that Jony Ive was, and somehow also needed Jobs to pull the best out of them in a way.
Yeah.
Although maybe not even to the extent of Jony Ive. I think perhaps it was the protection of Steve Jobs that Forstall had in the company that let him just get on with things when nobody else liked him, apparently. But, I mean, he was big in the iPod, right? That was Forstall.
He was still working on macOS when the iPod emerged. Mm-hmm. But then I think the famous Scott Forstall story here is that when Steve Jobs decided, it's time for us to do a smartphone.
Ah, yeah, that was it.
Then the question was, what operating system are we going to use for this? And at the time, the iPod was using a third-party operating system called Portal Player, and it wasn't very good. They'd skinned it up to make it look like an Apple operating system, but it wasn't really an Apple operating system. And so there were two camps that were pitching to Steve Jobs during this time. There was one camp that was saying, let's make the iPhone like a beefed-up version of the iPod. And then there was Scott Forstall who was saying, actually, no, we can make the iPhone a scaled-down version of macOS 10. That, at the time, was a very radical idea. Because if you look at the smartphone landscape back then, the operating systems that they ran were very limited and crude. They certainly weren't fully featured Unix implementations like macOS 10. So the idea that you could actually run an operating system remotely as sophisticated as macOS 10 was a completely out there suggestion.
Especially if you consider the time that they started working on the iPhone, like early 2005.
Yeah.
Apple, I don't think had even, or if they had, only just barely announced the transition from PowerPC to Intel. There were many, definitely at the time, there were many Intel Macs they hadn't shipped yet.
Yeah.
macOS 10 was only a few years into being able to run comfortably on all of Apple's computers. Like, early macOS 10, 2001, 2002, could only comfortably run on like a, Power Mac G3 or G4. By the time of 2005, it was only barely running on PowerBooks at the time. So the notion that you could then scale that down to a handheld, constrained device like an iPhone was truly radical. So I can understand why there was pushback, even though it might seem obvious at the time.
Yeah, and of course, as we know with hindsight, that's the direction that the whole industry went. One observation I wanted to make there in terms of the genius of Scott Forstall, we sometimes talk about the non-functional aspects of software design. So these are things that are not so much features. It's not what it does, but it's the way that it does something. And I think a really important non-functional aspect of iOS is the user interface of iOS never locked up. The user interface of iOS was just completely smooth and responsive at all times, even as other processes were taking place under the hood. And so the design thing, literally what it looks like, and those skeuomorphic aspects are an important aspect of what Scott Forstall was interested in.
Yeah.
But he was also very interested in these non-functional aspects, the more technical engineering side of user interface. And there were some quite unique things with UIKit and the way in which iOS was developed that ensured that UI constantly had the processor resources it needed to respond to your tap gestures at all time. And even those very early iPhones, they just felt incredibly responsive and like nothing else on the market.
And I think people lose the modern context because everybody knows how to use computers and how the internet works these days. But I think people miss the fact that skeuomorphism was the right idea at the right time. Like if you go back to the original Macintosh and the very first graphical user interfaces, they weren't very skeuomorphic. Yeah, they had like an icon of a trash can, but all of the, computers weren't powerful enough to be skeuomorphic. Like the original Macintosh operating system has checkboxes that are just checkboxes, has buttons that are just, a black outline with text in the middle of it, windows that are completely abstracted. It's a quote unquote desktop, but it doesn't, nobody's desktop is exactly 50% gray with abstract objects sitting on the surface. As computers become more accessible to more people and, consequently more powerful as the years go on, they adopt more skeuomorphisms that they didn't have at the beginning in the mid 80s. And I think it's truly once you get to the original iPhone, which is truly the computer for the rest of us that opened up the internet to like everybody on the planet, that's when you get to maybe like the peak skeuomorphism, which is very interesting.
On that note, before the iPhone, very few people had smartphones, but everyone had phones, but they had text-based, more or less, interfaces or, with a few icons in there. But they were nothing like smartphones. So being able to, I think one of the things that maybe pulled people into smartphones so fast was that they could see what was going on. Regular people, not the nerds who already had the weird things and the Blackberries and stuff like this. But regular people, you'd see something that looked like your calendar and it looked like a calendar. You'd see the books app and you'd use your finger with it to turn the page and it would follow along. It was neat. It was not only made things more obvious to people who weren't computer users, but it was a bit delightful as well, how the real world was kind of shrunk into the little box in your hand.
Yeah. It's interesting going back to something that Griffin you said, in terms of turning the clock back to the original Mac. And one of the things I wanted to talk about there is actually, where does Steve Jobs' interest in skeuomorphism come from, and what forms Steve Jobs' thinking about user interface design? So obviously the original Apple II computer, their first mass-produced computer, it had a text-based interface. And then with the Lisa and subsequently the Macintosh, Steve Jobs introduced a graphical user interface. And we won't get into the ins and outs of that, beyond observing that whilst I would completely agree with what you're saying, Griffin, that it was very crude in terms of skeuomorphism, for the time, it was highly skeuomorphic. So, for example, one of the design patterns that the original Mac had was a floating palette, which was a toolbox on the left-hand side of the screen. And you would click on one of those tools, and your cursor would become that tool. So, for example, if you clicked on a pencil, then your pointer becomes a pencil. And then when you move your cursor around the screen, you draw from the point of the pencil. And so it's not just that your desktop is a desktop with files and folders, and you open a file, and then you can literally draw on that file with a pencil. It's keying into this original idea, I think, that Steve Jobs had, that the Mac OS was entirely skeuomorphic. You know, there was a concept in the original Mac OS, as well as applications, you could have desk accessories. And so the calculator, which legend has it was designed by Steve Jobs himself, that calculator looked like a physical calculator. And we still have that in macOS today.
That's true. Maybe not to say that the original Mac wasn't skeuomorphic, but it's interesting how it became more skeuomorphic over time as computers got older, which is usually, we think of it as being, the other way around.
Exactly. That's the point that I wanted to make with the operating system next step that Forstall would work on with Steve Jobs. It was like the natural successor to that macOS user interface. It looked like macOS, but slightly more 3D. What you have over the years is Jobs and Forstall, as the technology became more powerful, edging towards what they always thought this was about in the first place. Like, the only reason that the original macOS wasn't more skeuomorphic was because they were doing as much as they could with the graphics power of the Mac at the time.
I'd say that there was one aspect of the original macOS that was very skeuomorphic, is that it was black on white. So deliberately like a piece of paper instead of white on black like everything else, or green on black, amber on black.
That's a really good example of that. Yeah, so it's very limited by what skeuomorphism became in iOS, but the thought process was right there. Interestingly, then Steve Jobs went through his wilderness years when he was booted out of Apple. But when he returned to Apple in the late 90s, Apple had sort of drifted away from this skeuomorphism. They were getting more abstract design patterns. And Steve Jobs brought them right back on track. And one of the first ways he did that was with the brush metal user interface. And I found a really interesting anecdote about this from a story by Nicholas Carlson for Business Insider in 2014. Who wants to read this? I've got a little quote from that.
The other day, a source told us how Steve Jobs reintroduced the concept of skeuomorphism to Apple after he rejoined the company in 1999. This source and some of his colleagues were working on a new version of Apple's audio and video playing application, QuickTime. Jobs was very adamant that QuickTime looked like a real stereo, says our source. The team kept coming up with designs. Jobs hated them all. No, you just don't get it. Then one day, Jobs came into a meeting with the design team with a piece of paper in his hand. It was a ripped-out page from a magazine. It was an ad for a Breitling watch, which had a brushed bevel finish that Jobs really liked. He put the ad on the table. Here, he said, just make it look like that. That's a very Jobsy story, no?
Mm-hmm.
It really is. And it goes on in this article to explain how no user interfaces look like this at this point. So the software engineers who were working on this, they had to figure it out. They didn't know if it was possible at first. What interested me about that brush metal anecdote was, as soon as Steve is back at Apple, he's on the case again of how can we make things look more skeuomorphic? How can we make the QuickTime player look like a stereo? So one of the things that I thought was telling in terms of Steve Jobs' thinking here was, I remember when he announced the iPhone in 2007, he did a lot of something that he tended to refer to as looking at the landscape. Let's look at the landscape of what else is out there. Well, there are these smartphones, and typically the top half of the device would be a screen, and the bottom half would be a little plastic keyboard. And then he looked at PDAs, and again, the top half would be the screen, and the bottom half would be the pen entry interface. So the bottom half of the screen actually couldn't display anything. It was just a space for you to write things. And so that was how almost all these devices were. And what Steve Jobs and his team were doing with the iPhone was like, well, let's make the screen go from top to bottom, and we will put in a skeuomorphic element on the screen for the lower half that can change depending on the task that you're doing. So the way that Steve Jobs was thinking about the iPhone was skeuomorphism at a hardware level. We're replacing hardware controls with the software equivalent. It was very much their way of thinking that everything on the iPhone should be skeuomorphic. This was a device where the screen would change the nature of the device depending on the task that you were doing.
Now, it's interesting that the physical design, the actual hardware design of the iPhone has kind of mimicked that in a way. So you go with a phone which changes its display to be anything. So rather than having buttons, you can have, rather than having a keyboard, it can have any kind of keyboard. But then the phone has become more and more just a screen. As the bezels have shrunk and the thing's got thinner, the home button's gone. I mean, you still got a few buttons around the outside, but in general, it's just a screen, and the iPad's the same. It's just really a screen that can be anything. And the rest of it is just there in service of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've changed as well. So the iPhone has changed, but we changed too. And so this was my next thought on skeuomorphism, because when the iPhone first came out, it was unfamiliar. So those skeuomorphic cues were maybe helpful for us to interpret how we should interact with it. But now that is not how we come to an iPhone. We come to an iPhone now with decades of understanding of how we should interact with it. And in addition to that, I guess there's a whole Gen Z generation. I don't know, Griffin, are you Gen Z or do you identify as millennial?
I'm a millennial. I was born in the 90s.
Millennial, okay.
Although I often find myself being the only millennial in a room full of other Gen Z people. Because a lot of my friends skew a little younger than me.
I guess if you're Gen Z, you're not just a digital native, you're an iPhone native. This idea of the iPhone having these virtual controls to replace plastic buttons is just a matter of history. And so as the user base of the iPhone has also evolved, the need for skeuomorphic cues has lessened. But there was a couple of people who didn't get the memo. Steve Jobs and Scott Forstall. What would you say was the most egregious use of skeuomorphism in iOS? Any examples you want to throw out there?
I think the most ridiculous one was actually on the Mac, and that was the calendar app that had bright orange leather and the ridiculous leather buttons. Leather buttons are never made of leather, so it never even made sense that those were there. But
that is fair. The one that I have in mind, I'll link to it in the show notes, but there was a hate article about it in Cult of Mac many years ago. I think Buster Heine, as I recall, it was in the application Passbook, which later became Wallet.
Oh, yeah.
I know where this is going, and I'll just say I love that one. The one that everybody hates is actually just a fun little bit of fun, is that in the Passbook app, this predated the Wallet app, but you add like a ticket, like a plane ticket or a movie ticket or something like that, and you're ready to discard it. You either swipe or hit the trash icon, and all of your other passes would fly off the screen, and then you would physically see a shredder come up and shred your ticket into thin little paper strips and then disappear off the bottom of the screen.
I like that.
Yeah, that one's lovely.
It was a bit of fun, but it took, I think, like 2 or 3 seconds for it to happen. So it was a technically cool thing, but it maybe was going a little bit far.
The animation that genuinely never made sense to me was in the Notes app. When you discard a note, you would tap the little hand-drawn trash icon. The lid would open up, and, that's fun enough. But then the note that you're ready to discard would use the same genie effect that the Mac had, where it would suck into the trash can. And
you didn't like that?
Because paper doesn't do that. You don't vacuum a piece of paper and it doesn't stretch and shrink into the trash can. The Apple Newton actually got it right. When you threw away a note on the Apple Newton, you would see an animation that was also a little over the top and kind of extra because it would take like 5 seconds to do, but it would crumble up into a piece of paper and then dunk itself into the trash can.
So that's actually an example where the skeuomorphism didn't go far enough.
Well, the trash can as well, the wire trash can, I'm not sure if it still has it, but it would have like pieces of screwed up paper inside on the Mac.
Yes.
But I'm thinking maybe, Griffin, as you like that one so much, maybe when you start a new note, you could have an animation of a tree being chopped down and pulped.
I mean, the thing is, like, you didn't actually discard a passbook ticket very often because nothing actually used that. Like, did anybody use that app in 2012? Not very often. But the thing is, you did throw away notes all the time because that's an app that people actually used all the time. So that was the animation that you saw much more often.
Scott Forstall was then intrinsically associated with this visual language of skeuomorphism. It's something that he and Steve Jobs really nurtured together at Apple. And as the technology allowed them to go further, they did go further. And I could almost see some parallels here between Jony Ive and Scott Forstall in their own way, in that they may be unrestrained from the influence of Steve Jobs. They maybe started to go a little bit too far with this. Some of the critiques of Jony Ive's time at Apple was when the hardware designs just got a little bit too uncompromising, when they just got rid of one too many useful ports from a MacBook, or they prioritized thinness over battery. And sometimes those minimalistic preferences of Jony Ive seem to just go a little bit too far. And in the same way, Scott Forstall, particularly after Steve Jobs passed away, he really doubled down on this language. And I remember when he presented the shredder animation in Passbook, he was so proud of it, and it was intrinsically connected to him. His legacy was introducing this at Apple. With Steve Jobs passing, a power vacuum was created. So when there were disagreements between the management team at Apple, Jobs was the one who made the decision. And because Jobs was so respected by both of his two product lieutenants, then his word went. And if a ruling didn't go Forstall or Ive's way, they just accepted that because it's what Steve wanted. Once Steve was out of the picture, there was no longer any decider. And
sorry to interrupt, but this, when you say the decider,
yeah,
all I can think of is that it's a Jamaican sound system MC. It's a perfect name.
Thank you for that.
Please continue.
This power vacuum that Steve Jobs left, it was like Ive and Forstall were a couple of fighting fish, and you could only have one in your aquarium, and someone had to go. And this was very much at odds with the character of Tim Cook. He likes a copacetic environment, a very demanding environment, but where everyone is respectful to each other. And I really don't think he knew what to do with these fighting fish, and he didn't know how to reconcile these disputes. And so this led to an inevitable,
I believe it got to the point where Ive and Forstall would no longer want to be in meetings with each other. They would meet separately and they refused to even speak to each other, which is, when you're talking like the highest levels of the company, is maybe not something that you want.
Craig asks Jony if he can pass the salt.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah. So here is a quote from the Wall Street Journal article on the subject published in October 2012. So who wants to read that?
Griffin, do you want to take a turn?
A person close to Apple said the company has a deep management and product development bench, and that the newly empowered executives will ensure a more collegial atmosphere. Misters Ive and Forstall clashed so severely in recent years that they avoided being in the same room together, said people who worked with both men. Quote, they didn't cooperate at any level, one of the people close to the matter said. They always let Steve decide.
So with this reshuffle, Scott Forstall was out and Jony Ive drank his milkshake. So Jony Ive got a promotion at the same time. And this, which I will pass on to you to read as well, Griffin, is from the Apple press release announcing this reshuffle.
Jony Ive will provide leadership and direction for human interface, HI, across the company in addition to his role as the leader of industrial design. His incredible design aesthetic has been the driving force behind the look and feel of Apple's products for more than a decade. I think it's kind of important to remember at this point that in the years after Steve Jobs had passed, Tim Cook was, I think, under incredible pressure to not make it feel as though the magic of Apple had died with Steve Jobs. And I feel like Jony Ive, being a slightly more public figure than Scott Forstall, was just the personality that they latched onto to say, no, we've still got it. It's not like everything's gone. Everything will be fine. We've still got Jony Ive. This is the guy who designed the iPhone, who's designed everything. If Steve Jobs died and then Jony Ive immediately was like, I'm out, I'm done with this, I feel like Apple would have been in a more tenuous position than they did.
This might be one of Tim Cook's first big decisions that favored shareholder value.
Optics?
Yeah. over actually what's good for the company. Really bringing Jony in as kind of a figurehead. He's okay, everything's still safe because Jony's here.
I think also Jony Ive is a polite, softly spoken individual, and he more fit in with Tim Cook's Southern hospitality and politeness sort of personality type. Whereas I think Scott Forstall, he was a very passionate guy, and I just think there might have been a bit of a personality clash. And actually, maybe looking back, given that Jony Ive did leave in the end anyway, and Scott Forstall was a software genius, I don't know, but maybe Tim Cook made the wrong choice there.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. But at the time, Jony Ive and Steve Jobs were the dream team. They were really what brought it back from the brink and came up with so many great things. I remember when Jony Ive was put in charge of software as well as hardware, and I thought, well, maybe that's good. He's got good taste, and maybe he's going to clean things up. The hardware works amazingly, and it has all kinds of innovations in there. Maybe that kind of stuff's going to go to the software as well. That didn't happen, but hindsight makes it pretty clear that it was not a great choice. But at the time, it didn't seem so bad.
I remember there was an interview in the late 90s, just after the iMac had come out and macOS 10 had just come out with it. And someone asked Jony Ive, it's so great the way that the user interface, the Aqua user interface of macOS 10 perfectly matches the hardware design of the iMac. And Jony Ive simply said, oh yeah, Steve does that. So Steve had performed that coordinating role of making sure that all the design thought process was joined up. And so without him, I think that was missing. And I think that was another reason why, on one level, it seemed to make sense for Jony Ive to take over both so he could actually do what Steve used to do, which is say, hey, does our software design and hardware design join up?
And a lot to say for Steve, the fact that Apple under Steve Jobs had at the highest level one person with one singular vision that could unite the company in that way to make everything coalesce.
Yeah.
He takes on the role less of a tech CEO and more of like a director, like a film director. He is directing Apple into his vision.
That is a good one. It's like how Robert De Niro is terrible in anything but a Scorsese movie.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because, that might apply to both Forstall and Jony Ive, like how they perform outside of a Steve Jobs movie. I mean, Scott Forstall's just sort of moved out of things altogether, but...
And Jony Ive has a new best friend now. And
all of this story then, we've had this soap opera drama. Steve Jobs passed away. There was a power battle and Ive won. So he's got the full design portfolio. He can do whatever the hell that he wants. And 1 year later, we get iOS 7. The timing is surely no coincidence. Skeuomorphism, which was so closely linked to Scott Forstall and his father-son relationship with Steve Jobs, is out the window. Funny that. It was maybe like what was going to happen design-wise anyway, but it's hard to not interpret it as there being something slightly personal about that too. What do you guys think about that?
That sounds about right, no? As soon as skeuomorphic loving Forstall's out, then Johnny's in there making everything minimal. Which is what he does.
I think a lot of people at the time had said that iOS was feeling stale by the time of iOS 6. People were getting tired of the extraordinary detail, and when everything is so rendered hyper-realistically, it just all adds up to visual noise. The other thing to consider is that doing skeuomorphism takes such an incredible amount of skill that there was only a very limited pool of graphic designers who could do it well, and most of them already worked at Apple. Third-party apps at the time of iOS 6 didn't look nearly as good as they should. The one thing that iOS 7 did is that because it was so easy to replicate, it made anybody be able to make a iOS app because it lowered the skill level. Apple was lowering the barrier to entry. You don't have to be a master in Photoshop to be able to make your contact sharing app or, Twitter or stuff like that.
Interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about what iOS 7 was not, which is skeuomorphism. So now we need to focus a little bit more on the visual language iOS 7 did adopt, which was a flat design style. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of UI was moving in this direction of flat design before Apple adopted it. There was an iOS app, it was a game that was highly regarded for its design, which was flat, and was considered to be very influential on Jony Ive and his design team as they developed the austere flat look of iOS 7. Do you remember what that game was called?
Was it Monument Valley?
I mean, that was a beautiful game, but that was a little bit more kind of 3D. This
I
was
know.
a
I
real
just wanted
flat
to
game.
say something, so just
Was
a
it
guess, just in case.
was it here's another shot in the dark. Was it Dante Box?
No, I'm thinking of Letterpress. Do you remember that?
No, I do not.
It was a very highly regarded game. It was like number one in the App Store for many months before iOS 7 came out. And everything about it was flat and typographical, and it was very beautiful.
It was beautiful. I remember it. It was like red and blue. And it was a word game, right? And with
It was,
the
yeah.
text was very big. There was not really anything of, lots of open space, lots of white space.
It was like the Wordle of its day, but it just had this beautiful sort of designer aesthetic to it. And that was considered to be a big influence. In fact, I've got a quote here from an article in The Verge about the iOS 7 design that came out at the time. If one of you would like to read that.
Okay. When Jony Ive took over as the company's head of design, he was given a list of forward-looking apps that suggested how iOS could evolve. The list included music app Audio, word game Letterpress, and a couple of task apps, Clear and AnyDo. I remember Audio. I used to use that, and I loved it, and that tanked immediately after Apple Music came out, I remember. Letterpress, I remember, yeah. And Clear and AnyDo
I was thinking until you said game and your lead in there, I was thinking of Clear, the to-do app.
Yeah, so it was a bit of a design trend. And there's an elephant in the room here, a certain other maker of operating systems that had really pioneered this flat look, which was
Was this
8
yeah.
with Metro design.
Metro, exactly. So Microsoft had introduced Metro. Tell us about Metro.
Metro was the name of the unified design that was going to come to the Windows desktop computers and Xbox and Windows Mobile. It was a design that was all flat. It had a bunch of these colorful tiles that were supposedly inspired by Metro subway signs. It was incredibly minimal, even more minimal than iOS 7. Like iOS 7 had a simple design, but it wasn't totally flat in my opinion, because the whole thing was that iOS 7 had layers. It had the frosted glass, the blurry title bars, the blurry keyboard and all that. And it had these, different layers that were supposed to indicate hierarchy. Like you pull down Notification Center and you can see everything behind you. Metro was completely flat, all flat colors, no Gaussian blurs, no hierarchy. This is just a pure blue screen. This is just a pure black screen. All these big tiles. It added a weird design quirk where instead of scrolling vertically, it scrolled horizontally. So you would have like a really small column of just like a bunch of small columns of text just like laid out horizontally that you had to scroll through. It had a lot of weird designs.
I liked Metro though. I really liked it. As a phone UI, I think it was super interesting because it was quite different than like the Android and iOS way of things, where you've got a home screen and then apps. You had a home screen, but the home screen was more like what we have as widgets today. And then you tap a widget and it would get bigger and you'd be in the app.
Xbox, to this day, it still has that flat design language from Metro and the tiles. So flat was having a moment. And I think what's interesting here is in design, I often think about Apple as being a leader. It often comes up with visual styles, which then everyone else copies. The mood was that people had gone off this hyperrealistic airbrushed look and people were getting into flat design. And somehow Apple hadn't got the memo and they were catching up on this. I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
I think that Steve Jobs died in 2011. And I remember around the year after 2012, there were like rumblings that Apple might be doing like this big software redesign. Or at least that's when it might have just been wishful thinking. That's when people started talking about it at least. And I remember there was a lot of speculation, like with iOS 6, whether they're going to have a big redesign or not. And, obviously that didn't come until another year later with iOS 7. But I think the remarkable thing is that we found out later in retrospect that Apple really didn't have a lot of time to work on the iOS 7 design. Like it wasn't a thing that actually took them 2 years. It didn't take them a full year. They hacked together what they showed at WWDC like the few months before WWDC, which is kind of remarkable. Like they weren't even working on it that whole time that we thought they were.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Because if it's true that Jony Ive instigated this when he took over software design, then they only had a few months. They didn't even have a whole year.
It felt like it too. I rarely install like early betas on the phone, but I did for this because it just looks so great. And it was super janky at the beginning.
I think it's interesting then to hear in Jony's own words how he described this design shift. So I pasted a quote into the chat.
That's my cue.
Yeah, Charlie, as our resident Jony Ive impersonator, do you wanna take that?
I think there is a profound and enduring beauty in simplicity, in clarity, in efficiency. True simplicity is derived from so much more than just the absence of clutter and ornamentation. It's about bringing order to complexity. iOS 7 is a clear representation of these goals.
What do we make of that?
It's typical Jony nonsense, no?
I mean, it's important to remember that like iOS 7 was a drastic new look for the operating system, but it didn't change the fundamentals of how it worked. One of the only truly new design elements that iOS 7 brought was the control center, which didn't exist in iOS 6, but like menus still worked exactly the same. Buttons were still laid out exactly the same. Nothing fundamental changed about the design, the layout, how your app worked. You know, there's the famous Steve Jobs quote that like, design isn't just how it looks, design is how it works. Well, iOS 7 didn't really change much of how iOS worked.
So what you're saying there is when Jony Ive says true simplicity is derived from so much more than just the absence of clutter and ornamentation, that actually is what iOS 7 represented, the absence of clutter and ornamentation. There were other aspects to the redesign of iOS 7 in terms of its look that I want to discuss. One was the font. Do you guys remember what font they used in iOS 7?
Helvetica Neue Ultralight.
Exactly, yeah, which was a very unusual choice in a lot of ways. I mean, one, it must have cost Apple a fortune because it's a licensed font.
Well, iOS had used Helvetica before. Now they just, took it to the extreme. They did a much lighter weight of it than before.
I think maybe one of the things that was on Jony's design team's mind was when you have this beautiful Retina display, it's nice to have these super fine lines because it can really show off the level of detail that the screen is capable of displaying. Another thing about the design that I found interesting was tint colors. Do you know what tint colors are?
Yeah, that's when the foremost UI element, like so maybe a drop-down menu or something, is tinted by the color of takes on a bit of the color of whatever's going on behind it.
Oh,
is that right?
That's another kind of tint color. I'm talking about this in terms of Apple uses for developers, that when you create an app, you can give your app a tint color in Xcode. And so that gives a color code for every app. So the ones that we would immediately recognize would be that Mail has a blue tint color and Notes has a yellow tint color, Calendar has a red tint color, and so on. And that was actually new. That came with iOS 7. And now we're quite used to that. And in fact, I think it was with Big Sur, it was introduced to macOS as well. And one of the really big changes, which they've now moved away from, is edge-to-edge design. And this is something they even talked about when they launched it. They didn't want to waste a pixel of screen space. So what you had in previous versions of iOS was this sort of design of nested padded boxes. So you'd like have a box and then a box within a box and a box within a box.
And in the bottom layer would be the gray and white pinstripes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if you had like a grouped list element in an iOS app, then each of them would be in a rounded rectangle with the pinstripes behind it, and there would be a margin around that. And what it meant was that if you looked at a pre-iOS 7 design, there would be lots of dead space on the left and right side of the screen of all this sort of padding and margin of the various nested boxes. And iOS 7 single-mindedly did away with all of that so that everything went right to the edge of the screen. And it was something I really liked. I thought it was kind of cool. It's not just about saving pixel space. I think it was also about just getting rid of clutter.
I liked it because it made your screen seem bigger.
Yeah.
Somehow.
You use every bit of your 3.5-inch screen.
Yeah. What's happened since then is with each iteration of iOS after iOS 7, they started adding a bit more padding in and adding more nested rounded rectangles back in.
Mm-hmm.
That's always bothered me. Like, I like how dense the original version of iOS 7 is. Like, the padding has gone back, the text size has gotten bigger, the spacing has been more generous. And now you don't actually have, like, that much more on screen, like list elements on screen as you have comparing iPhone 16 Pro to iPhone 5S.
Moving on, the reaction to iOS 7. What do you recall about how people at the time thought about this redesign?
I remember people would either wake up to an update or if they deliberately updated it, the phone would reboot. and everything would look completely different, and they'd think, what the hell has happened to my phone? It just looked so absurdly different and crazy as well. I mean, it wasn't like a slightly different design. It was the text was really thin. The default wallpapers and things were very brightly coloured, without contrast, like dark and light, not really any texture. And I think when you get a change that big, people don't like change. So there was quite a reaction to it, as I recall.
I think Apple pulled it off as early as they could, really. Because again, like still in 2013, like the iPhone 5S and 5C would still be a lot of people's very first smartphone, especially a year later when you get to the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. That was also the first smartphone for like even more people. That was the last like year of incredible growth, the 6 Plus year. And so I think like a lot of people like don't even remember iOS 6 in that regard.
Yeah.
You know, outside of our ahead of our time tech circles.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Yeah. When I was researching this episode and looking at that reaction at the time, I was really quite struck by some of the negativity, and some of the negativity in the media about the redesign of iOS 7. I don't think has aged so well. Here I found a quote from Joshua Topolsky, who was writing for The Verge immediately after the WWDC preview. I've pasted this quote into the chat, and I thought, Griffin, you might want to take this one.
Sure. Gone are lush skeuomorphic objects, dials, and textures. Instead, they've been replaced with stark, largely white and open app spaces, colorful, almost childlike icons, pencil-thin abstract controls for settings. The icons are striking to see, and they're the first sign that there are points of confusion and even missteps in Apple's new approach. It looks shockingly basic and more childish than elegant. There's an enormous feeling that Apple's designers couldn't decide on a direction. I'm not sure I agree with that. And for all the jokes about skeuomorphism, I would have preferred something nearer to the company's previous efforts than the new set, which seems closer to bathroom signage than even the Windows Phone's plainness.
Harsh.
So what do you make of that?
Josh was always one for a good hot take, I remember. I've reading him for years before he was at the Verge as well. Like a super smart take, but yeah, sometimes. But I just definitely disagree with this one. I think, you know, the idea that it's childish and shockingly basic, in a way, I guess it is, because it's very simple and flat compared to what he called lush skeuomorphic objects. And there you've got something flat. So I guess in that way you can call it childish, but really it's just more simple. I don't know. I think it was just a hot take, and it doesn't really hold up.
I mean, he has a few points in there, like a lot of the icons and things were drawn too thin. They would eventually dial that back. They would eventually make, bolder, more rounded iconography their whole style with, SF symbols and all that. Things would get more rounded, things would get bolder, but
that's true.
It does seem unnecessarily harsh, in my opinion.
That's an interesting take, because I think there are some valid points there, and I think it's something also to be mindful of even from the first preview of iOS 7 at WWDC to when it shipped the subsequent fall, some of those issues were actually already addressed. I thought the overall gist of it was wrong when you consider that by and large the design language that was established in iOS 7 we still use to this day.
My favorite reaction to the iOS 7 redesign was a Tumblr blog called Jony Ive Redesigns Things. And I've sent an example in the chat here.
Oh, yeah, look at that. I like the Fruit Loops one and the Honey Nut Cheerios.
Oh, my goodness. Charlie, will you describe what Griffith's just shared with us?
Okay, yeah, it's a screenshot. It's a bunch of cereal packets redesigned of things you know. Special K, Apple Jacks, Honey Nut Cheerios, blank colours. The text is that Helvetica?
All Helvetica Neue Ultralight.
That actually looks pretty cool. I would buy cereal packets like this, actually.
Yeah, so people were laughing about it at the time. Do you remember the car sickness issue? Do you remember about that?
Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten about that, actually. Yeah. Was it because of the parallax effect?
Yeah.
Was it that was causing car sickness?
I'm not sure. I think it might have been mass hysteria, to be honest. But yeah, I think it was all the different transitions.
The big flowy animations, how everything's flying and animating all the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Did they add reduced animation in reaction to that? It wasn't something that was already in there. Now we're used to that for accessibility reasons. But
from the original preview betas to when it released, they added controls to enable you to disable some of those transitions. We focus very much on the design of iOS in this episode because to me that's the main story about iOS 7. Can any of you remember any other features about iOS 7
Griffin,
beyond
you
the
mentioned one
redesign.
earlier, right?
The control center, the introduction of control center.
Right, yeah, Control Center was introduced. Any more?
Oh, once that was introduced, I could uninstall the flashlight app on my phone because it was now built into the system.
Was that too? Any more?
Oh, the first widgets, because those were in the Today view of Notifications
That's
Center.
right, yeah, that's right.
There was no third-party widget support yet, but there were a few Apple widgets.
Other big new features were AirDrop was introduced in iOS 7.
Ah.
The new app switcher, if you remember before, the app switcher was quite crude. You double tapped the home button and the screen would swipe up. And before it was just a row of icons, but with iOS 7, you actually got all the screens. It looks much more similar to what we have today. So just quickly, the other things that were new in iOS 7 was iOS in the car, which later became CarPlay, which had turn-by-turn directions, which was also new. And third-party apps could update in the background for the first time. Those were the main new features in iOS 7. So finally, wrapping up, I wanted to talk about the legacy. I mean, one aspect of the legacy is Jony Ive obviously was very much credited with this redesign of iOS, which did prove to be a success. And 2 years after the iOS 7 launch, he was promoted to Chief Design Officer, which was one of the 3 top C-suite executives at Apple, which is very unusual because other companies don't even have a chief design officer, and certainly not of an equal level to the CEO and COO.
And there isn't one at Apple today. Like he was really sort of promoted into the clouds, where I think at that point he was a little disillusioned and he wasn't actually doing that much work for Apple, but they couldn't bear to, take the stock price hit if Jony Ive actually left the company. So he promoted above the level where he was doing much real work.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing was just like a few years on from iOS 7, and just like Scott Forstall, Jony Ive was gone as well. But the influence of the iOS 7 redesign endures. So bringing it up to date, did you guys see the Airbnb redesign that was launched last month? Which, interestingly, Jony Ive has been involved in design consulting work. It's a strange direction that Airbnb has taken recently. Have you seen it?
Jony Ive's lining himself up with a lot of very bad companies, no?
Well, Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb, on X last month said, "Flat design is over. The future is colorful and dimensional." And if you look at the icons, they're introducing their redesign of Airbnb. They look a lot like classic iOS icons.
People who don't know what real skeuomorphisms is said, "Oh, this is Airbnb going skeuomorphic. This is Jony Ive adopting skeuomorphism." And it isn't really. It's like colorful icons doesn't make it skeuomorphic, as we've discussed earlier in this episode. It's just, hyper-realistic icons among a typical flat design.
The flat design is very nice, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. I think what we see here is there are flat aspects to this design, but the icons are very much like those very airbrush style icons that we used to see in iOS. These trends swing like a pendulum. And, I think what we're seeing is things heading back in another direction. And just this week, as we're recording this episode, Apple has swung back in another direction by introducing its own faux 3D elements. And just like with Airbnb, this is not skeuomorphism. It's a very abstract concept, these pieces of glass that float over the content. But it clearly is a richer, more 3D, more glossy, more airbrushy style design. And what do you guys make of that? And skeuomorphism, will it ever come back? Or did it ever go away?
I mean, it's like it's been toned down, hasn't it? It's still using, as we talked about, neomorphism.
Oh, yeah.
How the idea of using elements from the real world to give you hints about what a computer UI is going to do, but without aping every aspect of what it looks like.
Yeah, people will always be inspired by physical objects. Apple's introduction of liquid glass, they do this cold open where they just cut to a bunch of shots of Apple Park, like the glass panels, the big white rings around it, before they actually show you, okay, here's Alan Dye who is going to explain it to you. And then you see all the people in the background shuffling glass objects on the surface of a table, pretending to work while this video is being shot. People are always going to take inspiration from real world things, but the people understand smartphones now. People don't understand physical cameras. People don't need smartphones that look like physical cameras anymore.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of bringing real world design ideas into the computer world, there's an interesting trend, I guess, or in music application, music software, where you take the UI of a plugin or an app and you make it, you kind of turn it so it looks 3D, and then you make the buttons like stick out a bit, and you thicken the whole thing. So it looks actually like a box that you would buy, like a little instrument you would buy with, and the buttons are knobs and the sliders are sliders that you could grab. And whenever I see one of those, I always think, oh, I would really buy that. It looks so cool. Mm-hmm. There's something about the idea of something being physical that you can grab hold of that's attractive to us when we're just using a screen. I've thought about this a lot and still come to no conclusions.
So wrapping up then, Griffin, thank you so much for joining us in this episode. And if people want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
I've been on here a number of times and I've already plugged the usual places. I'm on the Cultcast, I'm on Mastodon. I'm going to plug a different ongoing project. You can find me on my personal website, dgriffinjones.com, where I occasionally post random odd things, including an ongoing review series where I'm going to review every serial of Doctor Who.
Oh, wow.
So a definite must for Whovians everywhere.
They're called Whovians?
I think they are. Are Doctor Who fans not Whovians?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Okay, anyway, I'm Charlie Sorrell, and you can find me on Mastodon at Mr. Charlie at indieweb.social.
And I'm Graham Bauer, and if you want to follow me on Blue Sky, you can find me at Graham Bauer at bsky.social. And that's it for this episode, and we will see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.